Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. I want to begin, and if you'll indulge me with some statements here, and then I'll get to a couple questions. I just want to correct the record from my standpoint. Having served in Iraq, sarin gas and VX were found when I was there, and I know it was found before I got there. So when we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, no, there was not a nuclear warhead on the end of an intercontinental ballistic missile on the pad when I got there. But we were talking about the very same thing that we're talking about today. When you go to the issue of trust and credibility regarding America or the president, I think it's not America's trust or credibility. I don't think that's questioned. I think it's the president's, and arguably, in my opinion, he's brought that credibility and trust upon himself. I mean, I think the American people look further back than Iraq and Afghanistan. They can look back to the Bay of Pigs under Kennedy. They can look back to Carter and Desert One, or George Bush and Ronald Reagan and Grenada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's appropriate when statements are made, and in some people's opinion, capriciously, we're going to attack the target, then you publish the target list, then you back up and say we're going to go to the Congress, that the president has blinked already, and his credibility is online, not America's. But I think it's appropriate, if this president is going to be the commander-in-chief in a war, and he would be, as he should be, that Americans weigh in based on his credibility and his prowess to prosecute such an action. And I think that he's diminished that in many people's minds, which is why not only people in this building and in this complex, but people around America are weighing in. It's a function of it. I'm not saying it's the only part of it, but I'm saying it's a function of their decision-making. In the briefing that I received, that many of you did, Syria has used this in some way, the regime, 11 times before. At least it's questionable 11 times before. So why did we wait to 12? That's a factor. So, and this Russian deal is important too, and it should be considered. But I would also say that, as we say in the Army, that no plan survives first contact, and there's going to be a price to pay for Russia's involvement, and they would desperately like to get more involved in the Middle East and in foreign affairs and world affairs and take the upper hand. And Americans, that's not a position that we feel comfortable with, nor should we. And so with that, I just wanted to correct the record on that regard. And getting back to the issue at hand, my concern is, as a product of the War College as well, about a strategy. And I asked Ambassador Ford in March what our strategy was once the red line was crossed. And I would argue with you that that an answer of "I don't want to go there" is not an appropriate response where this is concerned. And we are here at this point, and so we have to make the best of it. We want to support the president, but wouldn't, to General Scales or anybody on the panel here, wouldn't sealing, so to speak, in some terms, the Syrian border be a part of some kind of a strategy, arguing what we've already talked about those chemical weapons coming out of Syria? They're in Syria. It's regrettable. We don't like what's happening there. But isn't it arguably better for the free world to have them contained within the borders of Syria as a strategy to consider?
Wow. First of all, let me answer your first question. Presidents always have the opportunity to say no. And sometimes saying no carries with it the expenditure of more gravitas and personal equity than saying yes. And as I've said before, my great hero is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said no 8 times in the middle of the Cold War and came out in 1960 as one of our most revered presidents. So that's certainly always an option, and it doesn't necessarily reduce your credibility. To answer your question, I never thought of that. But I will say this: the Syrian border is far more porous than our own. And you may recall during the Iraq War that the rat line, which ran from Damascus to Baghdad, ran down the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and it was an open highway. Perhaps we could, but we'd have to get the cooperation of countries like Iran and Iraq to stop this. Perhaps we could do it, but boy, that would be an incredibly difficult task. But I take your point. I hadn't really considered that, and I think it's excellent.
Could I just make a quick comment? It's unfortunate we don't have a status of force agreement with Iraq. But in my dealings with Turkey, they are so suspicious of everything. Our airfield in Incirlik, they'll hold us up. Members of Congress want to get out. They'll hold us up 2 hours just to let us know they're the boss. I think it would be very difficult to get their cooperation. But, it's Worth trying.
Mr. Chairman, just one last question. Should we be more concerned as Americans, talking about the border as Mr. Barletta did, with a state-sponsored response in the way of potentially sarin gas coming out, or VX or anything, and being transported into our country, or individual organization responses, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, associated affiliates? What's more likely?
I think terrorist groups far more likely.
Absolutely.
I yield back. Thank you.